Houston Oilers. The Houston Oilers.
Houston Oilers #1.
That was a unique experience. Welcome back to the BestWorst09 podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Lewa. My next guest is the 21st president of DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. Prior to her role at DePauw University, she served as vice chancellor for students at Washington University in St. Louis, which is my current place of employment, and we truly miss her. She also served as the vice president for student affairs at Southern Methodist University. She's also held various roles at USC, Stanford University, Georgetown, and San Diego State, just to name a few. She serves on boards around the country, including on NASPA. And in fact, in NASPA, she was the 2009 recipient of Pillar of the Profession. Dr. White earned an undergraduate degree in psychology and English from UC Berkeley and a PhD from Stanford University in education administration and policy analysis. She's one of the most influential and courageous leaders that I've had a chance to get to know and work with, and I'm super excited to have her on this podcast, and I think that those who are listening are going to get a lot from this conversation.
Going one way is a two-way. It's the hard days that bring me back to love. Going
Welcome, Dr. Lori White.
Thank you, Joshua. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. I'm glad you agreed to do this. I know that initially when we started this conversation, you were actually in your transition to your role at DePauw University. And so it's just, I appreciate you taking a little bit of time, especially during these hectic times, to take some time. I really do mean it when I say you're an amazing leader. And so let me just go ahead and disclose to you, this is something that I've said in a couple episodes, and I'm going to say it to you as well, just to speak my truth, is that I have a goal of being a college president one day, a college or university president. And I know that there's not one path to get there, but I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on, now that you've been in this role for a little bit, if you can tell me about what does a college president do? What's the role of a university president?
Well, Joshua, I'm glad that you have said that you have an aspiration to be a college president. 80% of college presidents are white men. And so in order to diversify those who are college presidents, we need folks like you. You identify as African-American. Me identify as African-American, and I'm also a woman, to put our names forward for the opportunities to be a college president. So what does a college president do? And so really a college president is entrusted by the board of trustees of particular institutions to lead the institution, to make sure that we are able to admit the students that we identify as being a great fit for our university, to make sure that our students, while they are here, have the kind of experience that helps them realize their hopes and their dreams, that we stay forever connected to our alumni and encourage them to give us their time, their talent, and their treasures, and to continue to position our institutions as, when people ask me, what is my vision for DePauw, I say that I want us to be the best liberal arts college in the entire country.
I love that idea. I love that the idea of being the best liberal arts institution in the country. It was a joke at first, and then we really started to believe it with my admissions team in the last position I had, where I said, we're the best. We're the best graduate admissions program in the country. And, the tough thing about that is we never had a metric for that, like how we compare to other people. However, we had some internal metrics that kind of, for us, identified what it meant for us to be our best. And when we were at our best, I felt that we were the best admissions group in the country. So for you, as you think about that kind of idea of really pushing DePauw University to be the best, what does that look like for you?
So the best for me, and you're absolutely right, it's relative because all of us want to claim that we are the best. And I always put that out there because I think it's good to really strive. You know, if you're the San Francisco 49ers, that was my my pro football team growing up in San Francisco, California, I wanted them to win the Super Bowl, right? And so, you know, I want my institution to strive to win the Super Bowl of finding the absolute best, most talented students in the country, in the world. So certainly one metric is that students see you as a desirable place to go to college. I think another metric for me is that we are fully accessible to any student who desires to come to a place like DePauw without regard for their ability to pay. So I want to make sure that students who come from lower income backgrounds or students who may be first generation students and from lower income backgrounds are able to go to a place like DePauw. Best to me means that our students, when they graduate, they tell us that they really believe that they received the absolute best education because they had incredible faculty members, they had supportive staff members, they had people who invested in them. So those are some of the things that I think go into the definition of best.
I think that's great. The feedback that you get from your students is so important as they walk away because those are future alumni, future friends, future people who send people to the institution. And that totally makes sense to me. And so I think that's wonderful. So, all right. So I know I mentioned in your introduction your career path and some of the institutions you've worked with. So what was your kind of path to presidency? What was your how would you describe it?
Well, I will tell you this. I never imagined that I was going to be a college president. Wow. So unlike perhaps you and others who have set out this particular goal for yourselves, that was not necessarily ever my goal. So in my family, the PhD is the entry-level degree. So my dad had a PhD in clinical psychology. In fact, he was the very first African-American to receive a PhD in clinical psychology from Michigan State University. My dad's name was Dr. Joseph White, and he is known as the father of Black psychology. And I have a sister, Dr. Lisa White, who has a PhD in geology. She's one of the very few African-American women in the country, probably in the world, who has a PhD in geology. And she currently works as director of educational programs for the UC Berkeley Museum of Paleontology. Then I have another sister who is a singer / actress / paralegal / scriptwriter. So she's the artist in the family. And then I have a mom who was a registered nurse. And so I say all that to say that I come from both a family of educators as well as a family who is really invested in the helping profession, supporting others, and creating pathways for each succeeding generation to be more successful than the generation before. And so when I was an undergraduate student, I went to UC Berkeley. I majored in English and psychology. I thought initially I wanted to be a psychologist like my dad. I think sometimes our parents are our first professional role models before we even know really what we want to do in life. But as it turns out, I wasn't a great student as an undergrad. I think I was very intimidated by my perception that everybody at UC Berkeley was smarter than I was. Ironically, even though my dad was a faculty member, I was too scared to go to faculty office hours. And I didn't do any of the things that, you and I as student affairs professionals would advise students to do to be successful, right? Connect with resources, ask for help when you need it, get involved in perhaps research with a professor, find a mentor, all those things that we know are really critical to student success. And so when I graduated, having never gone to the Career Center, I don't even think I knew the Career Center existed. And even if I knew, I would have been too scared to go in. My dad was the one who suggested to me, well, Lori, given your interest in psychology, given the fact that he would say to me that you're really good with people, maybe you want to think about working in higher ed. Well, I didn't really know what that meant, Joshua, but I also knew I didn't have any career or job options when I graduated. And so I said, sure, I'll do that. And so I got my very first job at the University of California, Irvine in Southern California. And it was there I discovered what I came to know then as the student affairs professionals on campus. Because I saw these people advising, mentoring, coaching students, and I saw how students blossomed as a result of someone caring about them, knowing their name and their story, as we say at WashU. And I said, to myself, if I'd had somebody like what I see those people doing with their students, working with me in that way, how different my undergraduate experience would have been. I said, I want to do what those people do. And so for the last 30 plus years, I've been doing what those people do, really trying to think about ways to make universities and colleges work for all of their students, their wide diversity of students, regardless of a student's background. And again, as I said earlier, really committing our institutions to making sure that every student can facilitate their hopes and their dreams. So I've made that very long introduction to your question of, so how did I become a college president? So after being a vice president for student affairs at 2 different universities for over 13 years, a job that I really, really loved and would have retired as a vice president of student affairs, sometimes your mentors say to you, Lori, it's time for you to do something more. And so I was nominated, ironically, by another college president, a woman college president with whom I had appeared on a panel on female leadership. And she's the one who nominated me for the job at DePauw. And quite honestly, and I'll tell folks, this is why it's really important sometimes to just step out on faith. I never imagined I was going to get the job. I just thought, well, I'm going to go through the process. I'll get some feedback about how I would do in a presidential search. I can decide whether this is something I really want to do or not. And so lo and behold, as I always say to people, well, if I'm going to be in it, I'm going to be in it to win it. And as everything unfolded, I got the job offer from DePauw, and it just seemed to really be a great match for me and for the institution. And so here I am, the 21st president of DePauw University, the first African-American, the first woman, and right now I'm the only African-American president in the entire state of Indiana.
That is amazing. That's fantastic. So you mentioned mentors. I mean, this mentor kind of giving you this nudge or this push. And, I have a lot of mentors, and the great thing about my mentors is some of them know they are, others don't.
Yes.
Including you. So you talked about your dad, Dr. Joseph White, and his influence. And I want to get to your backstory in a minute here, but I want to tell you about a time when I came to you early to talk about my career one-on-one. I know you've been really good about meeting with professionals at any stage to talk about their careers and to help them out. And you told me, I told you I'd kind of skidded on my dissertation process or my PhD process. And I remember you told me something that people told me in the past, but you said your dad told you, get the PhD, the jobs will come. And So it kind of helped me to slow down my ambition around trying to get that next job and to really focus on what was important in my career field. Can you tell me a little bit about your dad and what kind of a mentor he was to you? Because his words clearly have passed through you to me and have influenced me. I've actually thought about that a lot throughout this process to the point where I'm defending here in a few weeks, right? So we're there. So
Right.
So if you can tell me about your dad a little bit more about his influence on you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad has this concept that he called the freedom train. And so he said, each of us needs to be a conductor on the freedom train. And being a conductor means that you commit yourself once you've gotten your ticket punched, and he would call, getting your PhD, your ticket. And so he says, once you get your ticket punched, then your role is to bring others aboard the freedom train so that they too can get their ticket punched, become conductors of their own freedom train, and bring others aboard. And I really like the visual of a train because, a train is always moving, right? And it can move in a bunch of different directions, but it's always moving forward somewhere. And then you've got somebody who is pulling passengers aboard at every stop along the way. And so my dad always said, the mark of a good mentor is, not only your commitment to investing in the next generation, but when your mentees actually surpass you. And in terms of, stature, in terms of their career, in terms of, what it is that they're able to do in their work that's significant. And so my dad passed away 3 years ago. And when we had his celebration of life's service, which really was a celebration of just joy. And, everybody, all his students came back, and people believe that my dad was single-handedly responsible for over 100 people, mostly people of color, mostly first-generation students getting their PhDs. And then imagine every single one of them has now become conductor on their own freedom train, and they're doing the same thing that my dad taught them to do. So a life well lived.
Absolutely. I think about that's just I love the visual of the Freedom Train and the conductor and bringing people on as a part of your responsibility. And I also love the lack of ego of bringing them on but keeping them in place versus bringing them on and hopefully they pass you and surpass you.
Yes.
And do their best. Also, what this reminds me of, for some reason yesterday, I decided to look up the word legacy. You know, and they had so many versions of it. You know, they had, you know, people who go to college because their parents went to that college, that leaving property and houses and cash to your kids is a legacy. But I didn't see the way I typically think of the word legacy. And so I'm kind of curious about you. Your dad clearly has an impressive legacy, which has impacted way more people than he could have impacted directly. And I believe that you have too. What does it mean to you to be a legacy or to leave a legacy?
So it's interesting you should ask me that question about how do I define legacy? What does it mean to leave a legacy in the context of you also asking me about how did I end up being a college president? And so I've got to tell you a little bit of the story. So I already told you the first part, how I was nominated for the job, how I went through the interview process, how I wasn't even sure that I was actually going to get the job, but actually figured as long as I'm going through the process, I may as well be in it to win it. So when it looked as if I might actually get the job offer to become the president of DePauw, I came to visit the campus and I was in what I would call discernment mode. As I said, I loved my job as vice chancellor for student affairs at WashU and had made a home in St. Louis and wasn't sure I wanted to pack up, you know, my husband and I to move to a small town in rural Indiana. And so as I was touring the beautiful DePauw campus, I went into one of our iconic buildings, which is called East College. And on the second floor of East College is a hall that's named Meharry Hall. But back in the day, that used to be the place where the DePauw community gathered for church services, chapel services, they were probably called back then, because DePauw was founded initially as a historically United Methodist church. And or affiliation with United Methodist Church. And so in this hall, Meharry Hall, you can see a pipe organ in the background. The places where people sit are old church pews. You can see that. You can visualize where the pulpit needed to be or used to be. And I'm a very spiritual person. And so, you know, whenever I'm trying to figure out a big decision in my life, I ask the higher power for a sign or some guidance. And so in this room is also where the portraits of all of the previous presidents of DePauw hang. So I looked out and I saw numbers 1 through 20. And then I see the space where number 21, that's who I am, will eventually hang. And I heard God saying to me, you know, number 1 through 20 don't look anything like you, Lori. And he said to me, you know, you need to be an inspiration for future generations of DePauw students and DePauw presidents. They need to see somebody who looks like you, portrait at number 21. He said, it's not about you. He said, it's you paving a way for others. And so I'm here because I want, you know, every young woman on campus. I want every student of color. And certainly, you know, all the students who don't identify with the same demographics that I do, to be able to see somebody like me and say, it is possible for somebody who doesn't fit the traditional image of what people are used to seeing as a college president to be one. And perhaps now I'm creating a path for the next generation. So I hope that that's my legacy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's going to be an amazing legacy that people are going to benefit for forever, as long as we exist on this earth. So I really appreciate that.
Well, at least my portrait will now be there forever.
Well, I think let's add that to my journal as far as I know when I arrive, when I get the portrait of my. So I have a question, just one more before we get into your backstory again, because these things just keep bubbling up. When you look at your approach to leadership, and you know, in your various roles, and even regarding this role, what's your leadership philosophy, or what's your approach as you go into leading complex organizations with so many people? You mentioned in your introduction of your position, you know, your alumni, current students, you know, the board, I'm sure, is a part of that. So what's your approach to leadership in such complex organizations?
Well, I think those who have worked with me before would probably describe me as a leader who's collaborative, because I don't believe that leaders can make unilateral decisions without getting other people involved, because as one of my mentors says to me over and over, people are committed to what they help to create. So certainly there are some instances where a leader has to get in there and make a decision, in times of incredible challenge, in times when, there's a critical incident blossoming on the campus and you need to step in there. But in regular times, I really think it's important to be collaborative, to get folks involved, particularly at universities, where we're about shared governance. And so, it's really important for me as I think about the future of DePauw to be able to invite into those conversations our faculty, our students, our alums, clearly our board, and others. So, I think people would describe me as a collaborative leader. I also think it's important for a leader to lead with vision. And again, vision is not something that I can unilaterally impose on an organization, but nobody wants to work for a leader who has no vision at all, right? And so I really like to try to articulate for people where it is I think we can go as an institution, where we can go as an organization, and then rally people around that vision and invite them to help me put some meat on the bones of that vision, as one might say. I've already talked about the fact that, in my family, we really have a commitment to service and a commitment to paying our lives forward. So I hope people would see me as the kind of leader who's invested in the professional growth and development of the people who work with me and for me. I think that's really important as well. And I hope people see me as a leader who is honest and transparent and an effective communicator, because I think many times when leaders are not successful, it's not because they don't have great leadership skills. It's because people perceive them as not being able to effectively communicate whatever it is that their vision is, or effectively bring people along with them, or to be transparent in their decision making.
Yeah, that last piece for me, that's a conversation that I often have with a lot of different people, which is, even if you might have the wisdom and you might have the experience, if you're not able to influence or move people along in that direction because of communication in particular. I mean, you could be saying all the right things, but how you say it, I've learned, is really just as important.
Yes. And you also have to, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think something that's really important. I think an effective leader has to be able to admit when they're wrong and admit their mistakes. And, there will be some leaders who would argue a leader should never show vulnerability. I just don't believe that to be the case. I believe people will trust me more if I'm willing to say, you know what, I didn't get that right. You know what, I was wrong about this. Oh, you know what, this is what I've learned.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. It resonates because I've worked with past leaders who are trained never to apologize, never to say I'm sorry, and never to admit wrong. And I think that really puts them in a disadvantage when it comes to total buy-in. I feel like that's an old model that grew out of the 80s and 90s and really took root. And I love the observation of leadership that I'm seeing now, which is this way more transparent, owning up, and really trying to make real change and real difference and real improvement. And a part of that is being humble, because you're not going to get it right 100% of the time, which is a good reminder to be kind to ourselves and it's okay to mess up. All right. So I think you mentioned the San Francisco 49ers and you mentioned UCI. And of course, being a West Coast guy myself, I'd love to know about your backstory. If you can tell me a little bit about, your upbringing.
Sure. So I had this fabulous childhood growing up in San Francisco, California. I grew up in the San Francisco, California that I grew up in is very different than the San Francisco, California that people think about now, with all of the .com businesses and,
Yep.
Young people making, $1 million in stock options and no kids because nobody can afford to live there. That was not my San Francisco. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in an area called the Richmond District of San Francisco, where people had a ton of kids. And, this was the time period in life when, parents could let their kids, roam free outside. And, you didn't have to come into the proverbial streetlights came I grew up across the street from Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, which had fabulous museums. And back in those days, all the museums were free. So the art museum, the aquarium. My sister says she learned about science or her love of science from being able to go to the Science Museum in Golden Gate Park. My other sister, my mother would sign us up for summer classes offered by the park. And there were a number of like acting classes and musical theater classes that my other sister got really involved in. And so, being able to grow up in a city where I lived in a diverse neighborhood, where I assumed the whole world was like my neighborhood and didn't realize it wasn't until I went away to college, to be in a city where the, arts and the resources like museums were free to all kids. There was a library in our neighborhood where, I got to check out books. I was always the person in my class who'll love this story. So every summer we would have a reading contest. And the teacher would say, when you come back in the fall, whoever went and reads the most books gets like a little prize. Well, after a while, everybody in the class just deferred first place to me because I always won hands down. I always read way more books than anyone else in my class. And it was just a really great place to grow up. And so I think my ability to think about the world through a multicultural framework, even though I identify very strongly with my African-American heritage, I think was really forged in my multicultural neighborhood in San Francisco. And so I'm forever grateful for having the opportunity to grow up there. And it makes me sad to see the neighborhoods that I grew up in and spent so much time in change so much, Joshua, because an average person now can't afford to live in San Francisco. There's no kids left in San Francisco because people can't afford to buy a house there and then afford childcare. And there was a thriving African-American community in San Francisco in a district called the Fillmore District. My parents, by the way, were both, neither one of them were born in San Francisco, but they both came to San Francisco as teenagers. And so, they had deep roots in the city as well. And so not to have a thriving African-American population in San Francisco also breaks my heart too. And I became a 49er fan and a Raider fan. I don't know if you can be both and hold both of those things. They're probably in conflict with one another, but deep roots in both of those football teams.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you can do both. I think that's totally fine. I grew up in Southern California. And
so who's your team? Not the Rams.
No. So here's the unfortunate piece that friends who are close to me know. My team is the Houston Oilers. And in the background, you can see. Yeah, Houston Oilers.
Houston Oilers, number one.
Oh, I'm more of a fan of you already. Oh, you know the song, Go Big Blue. You can see the hat in my background.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness.
And so my friends would always make fun of me because once they moved to Tennessee and then changed to the Titans, I lost the team. I tried to follow the Texans, couldn't do it. And so, I grew up around a lot of 49ers, Rams, and Raiders fans growing up in California, but so I say I'm still a Houston Oilers fan. If I was a multi-billionaire, I'd bring the Houston Oilers back.
Bring them back.
I've literally never been to Houston, but I'd move to Houston and I'd buy the Oilers back.
Well, so now the Raiders are going to Las Vegas. First of all, Las Vegas is not ready for the Raiders. I mean, that is just going to be crazy, Joshua. All those crazy Raiders fans in their silver and black in Las Vegas. Oh my God, it's on and popping. But I just can't imagine calling them the Los Angeles Raiders. I mean, the Las Vegas Raiders. It was hard enough calling them the LA Raiders. They're always the Oakland Raiders to me.
Yeah. I remember going to LA Raiders games, one LA Raider game when I was younger and they were in LA. And I remember that was an unique experience.
Well, in fact, so I don't know if you remember when the Raiders and the Rams shared the same stadium, the LA Coliseum, for a minute. Yeah. And so people would always say, one Saturday you'd go to the Rams games and people would be picnicking in the park, with crystal vases and, very polite to one another in the stands. And then the following Saturday or Sunday, with the Raider fans would come and, you'd have to have all of, everybody from LA security and everybody else out there. And you would bring your wife to the Rams game, but you'd go to the Raider games with your boys, right? Yeah. That was a whole different experience. So anyway.
It might go down and you need the boys with you. I saw a few.
A whole different experience. Yeah.
A few scuffles. Let's just say that. Just a few. All right. So I want to maybe take a little bit of a break here, and then I think it's time to get to the big question.
No sleep, only for the weary. Don't speak, let your dreams escape. Nothing that I can say or do can take away my pain for you. Taming the beast is not so easy now.
All right. So it's been great going back down memory lane with you. So as you know, this is the Best Worst Thing podcast. And for listeners, if this is your first episode, this is a chance for our guests to share a personal or professional setback, difficulty. And it's a chance for them to share about, the what happened, and then how they kind of worked through that situation. And then what are some lessons or insights they'd like to share with our listeners. And so, Dr. Lori White, what is your best worst thing?
So I'm going to start with the lesson and then talk about the best worst thing. The lesson is you cannot look for validation from your oppressor. And so let me now talk about the best worst case scenario. So I was working at a university that shall remain nameless. I was hired by someone with whom I had a great relationship. After 3 years, that person moved on and I got a new boss. Now, my new boss was somebody that I had known. We had been peers and we had worked together quite well as peers. However, when he became my boss, the dynamics in our relationship shifted. Now, some things I would say that I bore 50% responsibility for our relationship not working out well, as the dynamics between us shifted from peer to peer to boss, supervisor, supervisee. So in retrospect, I can see where 50%, I contributed to 50% of the demise of our relationship. So my old boss, his style was that once he hired me, he had full confidence in my ability to get the job done, and he pretty much left me alone and let me do my thing. My new boss was, in my mind, much more of a micromanager. I don't really know if that was completely accurate, but he just wanted to know a lot more about, what I was doing day to day in my previous boss. And I interpreted that as him micromanaging me, and him not having confidence in my ability to do my job well. And so as we got into this cycle of him being frustrated with me because I was frustrated with him because he kept asking me questions that my old boss never asked me, and me feeling that this new boss didn't have any confidence in my work, my self-confidence then started to wane. And it got to the point where I started making, smaller mistakes and then larger mistakes because I just didn't have the same level of self-confidence in my ability to do my work that I once had based on my relationship with my previous boss. And so it got so bad that my staff en masse came into my office and said, Lori, you are not yourself. This is not a healthy environment for you. You need to look for another job, which I ultimately did. And so what I discovered was I was allowing this person who I believe didn't have confidence in me and my abilities to determine how it was I saw myself. Instead of me realizing I'm still a great professional. He and I may have different styles, and it may well be that we can't work well together, but it doesn't really have anything to do with me and my abilities. It might have something to do with my inability to adjust to his style, but I'm still the same, hopefully smart, competent professional that I have always been, but because I'm so hungry for him to validate who I am, and when I'm not receiving that, I'm interpreting it as there was something wrong with me. That was a really bad place for me to be. And so I ultimately left, and clearly I am a great professional because I'm now president of a university. So, I wasn't the not so good professional that I believed he believed me to be. And so, what I said, the lesson learned was that you can't look for validation from your oppressor. And oppressor is probably a really strong word. But I use that to say that, in all of our lives, there are people either who we work for, people who live in our neighborhood, people who are even elected officials who may try to get us to believe that we are less than who we know who we are. And if we are depending upon them to validate who our mama says we are, who our grandmama says we are, if we're looking to these other people for validation, we are looking in the wrong place, right? And so, you need to hold on to the fact that you are absolutely as good as you know that you are, and not let anybody ever detract you from that.
Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. And I can tell you, I was listening to somebody speak about public speaking. They talked about how when people talk, automatically your audiences are connecting to their story. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now, thinking about you inheriting this new supervisor who was your peer. I've had it both ways. I've had peers who I've started supervising and they chipped away at my confidence, or at least I allowed them to chip away at my confidence. And I've also inherited new supervisors and have internalized some of that, maybe over the top, either micromanaging or need to have this dominance. They maybe aspire to the social dominance theory, and that's a real big thing for themselves as far as needing to have a handle on everything. And the fact that it really starts to chip away, even for somebody like you, that's just amazing that people need to hear that even for someone like you who's achieved what you have, that you were susceptible to this thing in the past. And what a great lesson to learn from so many people who are going to be getting a chance to listen to this. One of the things I find interesting is you said that, in retrospect, you can really own 50% of the relationship, and that helps you to really have maybe a more balanced look at the overall situation. It still doesn't take away his behavior or his approach to leadership. But kind of looking back, was that hard for you to kind of accept that 50% because for me, when I think about my past, I have two supervisors in mind in particular who I look back, and one of them I'm like, he was just a hurt person. The other one I was like, he was just I won't cuss in front of you out of respect, but he was just a jerk. And so and I've had a harder time kind of really trying to own where I was at fault. So for you, as you kind of look back, was that kind of hard to recalibrate?
Well, I think with maturity comes perspective, right? And so, it's interesting, all of us, of course, are centrally ego focused, right? So when a relationship goes bad, whether it's a supervisor or a supervisee or a romantic relationship, it's never the other person's fault. I mean, it's never our fault. It's always the other person's fault, 100%, right? And then, later on, as we start to unpack things, we can all see, okay, well, maybe I contributed in some way, shape, or form. And so, I've really used the story that I shared with you as a leadership mentor moment lesson with people with whom I've worked, because that one of the big takeaways for me with that relationship, when I talked about the 50% that I own, was that when somebody is your boss, they get to decide what they think is important, right? And then you have to decide whether you want to work for that person based on their style, based on what they think is important or not, right? You resisting them is not going to get you anywhere, right? And so, when people work on my team, hopefully they feel excited about the vision that I'm bringing. Hopefully they feel excited about the opportunity to work for me. But there are people who might decide they don't want to work for me. And that's cool. But, resisting when I'm not going anywhere isn't going to get them any further, right? It's just going to make them more frustrated. So that's the lesson that I learned, was the reason that the relationship didn't work out, my 50% of it, was that I just kept resisting his style, because his style wasn't like my former boss, right? And I didn't realize until later, oh, wow, he's the boss. He gets to decide. And what I got to decide is whether I can work for him or not.
Yeah, I think what that tells me also too is that now, and you learned that you have more control of the situation than maybe really accepted before. Because before you just tried to resist and stay in it, and it just wore away at you.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Your confidence was eroded. Yes. Your productivity and your mistakes went up, and your productivity probably went down. But again, I think you mentioned this earlier, you can apply this to any situation, whether it's work or relationships, is that if you have a choice, if there's just an ounce of you has a choice, then you can make a different choice. Right. And that's a very empowering thing, because you don't have to go through that.
No, you don't have to go through that.
Create an exit strategy, job search, figure out what you need to do, realign yourself and make your transition if that's the need. Absolutely. But to stay in it and to get beat down like that, it has an impact. It really does.
No, it really does. And, it's interesting, really, sometimes we think we don't have a choice, but really we always have a choice, right? Because, staying in a job or a situation because you feel like you can't quit. I can't quit because financially I can't do it. I can't quit because, of X, Y, and Z. But think about what will happen to you if you don't, right? As you said, health-wise, psychologically, confidence, whatever that is, it could be greater detriment to you than you just saying, I'm out and let me figure out some other alternatives, even if I've got to get a couple jobs, a couple side gigs, move in with my mama, whatever it might take. But, that sometimes is a much better decision than trying to stay in a situation which is probably not going to get better.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd rather pay that cost.
Yeah.
I mean, long term, I think that's a lesson that a lot of people, again, hopefully should think about. I know that in previous episodes, I've had feedback from people who've gone through similar career struggles where they've really gained a lot from it. And from this one, I think that you've just really put a fine point on it. So I really appreciate that. Well, Lori, I think we're at that time where we're going to wrap up, but I just want to thank you again for taking time to be with us here on the Best Worst Thing podcast. Again, you're such an inspirational leader, and your words live on, and I'm certain your words, similar to what your father did for you and how they passed through you, your words, those that you've also created, are going to continue to leave a legacy for so many people, and so I appreciate that. If people want to get a hold of you, or if they want to see videos of you, or if any way of, what's the best way for people to do that?
Well, seeing videos of me, one of the things about being a college president is there's videos of you all over the place. So all they have to do is Google my name, either Lori White, or my middle initial is S, Lori S. White. So they can find me all over the place. And then to get a hold of me is president@DePauw.edu. So DEPAUW. There's another school that ends in an L. So if you want to find me, you have to go to DePauw. So looking forward to hearing from folks. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Best Worst Thing podcast. I'm your host, Josh Walewa. Music is produced by DJ Josh1. You can follow him at Boom Note on Instagram and Twitter, and Josh1 on Spotify. The Best Worst Thing podcast is edited by Cool Jets Audio and Visual. You can find them at Cool Jets AV on Instagram. Our marketing is designed by Francesca Daniels. You can find her at FrankandKitty24 on Instagram. And our overall design is by Inspired Design with Ryan Daniels. You can find them at getinspired.design on Instagram. Please download us from iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite platform. And remember to share us with your friends, especially those people you think really need us in their life. Don't forget to give us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening to the Best Worst Thing.
The cool Cali kid from the boondocks. Bounce through your hood like chocolate with a crime on. Independent thing to play a beat, I get my rhyme on. So when I strut on a path to perfection, city to your borough, to your town, to your streets. Keep your party live, Josh 1. Got beats out of nature, Grazer, Oakland, strays to Asia. It's like Fraser, force of Fantasia. Move through your